Masechet Menaḥot Daf Chaf Aleph. Gufa Amar Ze'iri Amar Rabbi Chanina Dam Shebishelo Eno Obed Alav. We're going back to a statement that we saw on the previous daf, where Ze'iri says in the name of Rabbi Chanina that if blood is cooked, then one is not liable for drinking it. Any blood, if you drink it raw, then one is liable. However, once it's cooked, it's a different form, and then one is not liable. Yatib Rava v'ka'amar la lehashma'ata. Rava, later on, in a later generation, was repeating that tradition. Itibe Abaye hikpa et adam va'achalo o shihimcha et hacheleb ugma'o hayav. And so Abaye, Rava's colleague, says, wait, there's a baraita found in the Tosefta that seems to contradict it, because it says if someone hikpa, curdled blood, meaning he cooked it and ate it, or if he took fat, chalib, which it's a natural state, is a solid, and he melted it and then swallowed it, he is liable. The point here is that even though the dam is generally a liquid, if you turn it into a solid, or a solid fat, prohibited fat, that you turn into liquid and eat it, one is liable. Anyway, this contradicts Ze'iri, because Ze'iri said that if you cook blood, you're not liable. But this baraita says if you cook blood, one is liable. La kashya kan shehikpa ba'ur, kan shehikpa bahama. Ba'ur lahadar, bahama hadar. Rava responds that when Ze'iri, when in the case where you cook it in the fire, that's Ze'iri's case. Because when you cook it in fire, then it gets hard and does not go back to its original liquid state. And so that's a case where it's permanently changed its form, and therefore one is not liable for eating that curdled blood. However, the baraita, where it says one is liable, that's when one curdled it just in the sun. And the sun, yeah, it will be curdled while it's there in the sun, but then it will go back to its original form. Abaya asks, Bahama name, lema ho'il ve'ideche, ideche, taha be'amine rabbi mani Rabbi Yochanan, dam shekarash v'achalo, mahu, amar le ho'il v'nitcha yidache, ishtik. Abaye, however, challenges this distinction between in the fire and the sun. Maybe the idea that the fire is hotter and then it's more permanent, but the sun is not so hot, so it congeals temporarily, but not permanently. But anyway, Abaye objects, because we should say that once something is rejected, it's rejected. That's a general rule that regarding things that can be offered in the Bet HaMikdash. Let's say something is legitimate, it can be given in the Bet HaMikdash. It can be sacrificed. And then for some reason, it becomes disqualified, even temporarily. But there's a general rule that once it becomes disqualified, even temporarily, then that's it. It's permanently disqualified, even if later on it goes back to its original state. The idea here is that the reason that we're connecting two halachot, the prohibition of drinking blood, is directly connected to the fact that blood can be used as in a sacrifice and placed on the mizbeach. If it cannot be placed on the mizbeach, then it's no longer liable for eating, for consuming the blood. And so once this blood was you're able to put it on the mizbeach when it's in liquid form. You put it in the sun. Now it's dry. At that point, it's disqualified. Once something is disqualified, it's permanently disqualified. Therefore, even if it goes back to its original liquid state, it should still be not liable. And we know that this is a rule because the Rabbi Maneh asked Rabbi Yochanan about blood that became congealed and then one ate it. What's the law? And he said, once it's disqualified from being put on the altar, then it's permanently disqualified, and that means it's disqualified also for the prohibition of consuming blood. And so therefore, this distinction does not make sense. Doesn't matter if it's temporarily or permanently congealed, it should still be by that from then on and forever not liable. So instead, Abaye suggests a different answer. Amar le, dilma vaday kan bechatot achitzonot, kan bechatot hapinimiyot. It depends what kind of chatat it is. If you're talking about chatat hachitzonot, that's when Ze'iri. When Ze'iri said one is not liable for congealed blood, That's if it's a blood from a korban hatat that's sprinkled inside the kodesh, like for Yom Kippur, because in that case it cannot be offered in a solid state. The blood inside has to be sprinkled. You have to dip it and it has to be sprinkled. So therefore, once it gets hard, that's it. It's no good. Whereas the baraita that said that one is liable even for congealed blood, that's talking about most chataot, which are only offered on the outside mizbeach. On the outside mizbeach, it doesn't have to be sprinkled. It just has to be placed on the mizbeach. And even congealed, hard blood can be, you could take a piece and place it on the mizbeach. And as we're about to explain, Amar, Rava said to Abaye, Id kartan mileta, you reminded me of a tradition about this very matter. Damar Rav Chisda, dam shekarash behataot v'achalo chayab, velakach v'natan amar achamana, bal lekicha untinahu, behataot hapinimiot v'achalo patur, tabal v'hiza amar achamana, b'hai lav, bal tebila v'haza'ahu. Rav Chisda said that blood that congeals, regarding chataot, this is the external, regular chataot that are only placed on the outside mizbeach. If it congeals and one eats the blood, one is liable. You know why? Because for outside chataot, the pasuk says that the kohen will take some of the blood and place it on the mizbeach. And even if it's congealed, the kohen could still take a piece of that congealed blood and place it on the mizbeach. Since it can be used on the mizbeach, therefore one is liable for consuming it. However, chataot that are offered inside the hechal, if one eats that, then is not liable, because the pasuk there says he has to dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle in the kodesh. So you can only do that if it's in a liquid form. And so this is not, if it's congealed, then you cannot dip and sprinkle, and that's the difference. So Ze'iri, who said not liable, is talking about inside sacrifices, because it's not, once it's congealed, it's not usable anymore. Whereas the Braita that says liable is talking about outside korban, outside chataot. Ve'ravadi de amar. Now all that was explaining the opinion of Ze'iri, who said it's not liable once it's cooked. However, Rava himself had a different opinion. Before, he was just trying to answer the question from the Braita against Ze'iri. But his own opinion was different. He said, Afilu b'chatot hapinimiot v'achalo hayav. Even regarding the inside korbanot, if you eat blood that's congealed, one is liable. Why? Hoil uchnegdo ra'ui b'chataot hachitzonot. Because there is corresponding to it outside korbanot. So in other words, we're not going to make a distinction between this kind of chatat and that kind of chatat, since there are some kinds of chatat where you could put the blood when it's congealed. Therefore, those are prohibited. One is liable for that. Since there is a category of chatat blood that is liable when it's congealed, we apply that to all of the category, and therefore even for inside chataot, once it's even when it's cooked, nevertheless, one is liable. So Rava is stringent. Amar Papa Hilkach dam hamor shecharash v'achalo hayab hoil uchnegdo raoi b'chataot hachitzonot. Rava says, therefore, if you have blood of a donkey is not a kosher animal. You can't sacrifice that blood. It's not kosher. It's not a kosher animal. Now you have blood of a chamor that congealed and one ate it. One is liable. Why? This is not something that can be offered on the mizbeach. It doesn't matter. Once you have this logic, then you say, we're not going to distinguish between categories of blood, since there is a type of blood, which is korban hatat, of a kosher animal that's sprinkled outside, where even though it's cooked and congealed, still you can use it on the mizbeach. Since there is some type of blood like that, we're going to apply the prohibition and the liability even to blood of a non-kosher animal. Amar Rav Gidel Amar Ze'iri, dam ben lach ben yavesh hotzes. Since we quoted one statement of Ze'iri, here's another one regarding blood. That blood, whether it's moist or dry, is a chatzitza. If one goes to the mikveh and someone has, this applies nowadays, a woman has a scab or some dried blood on her skin, so then it's a problem of interposition between the skin and the water, and the tevilah is not good. Metibe hadam behadiyo v'hadebash v'hehalav yeveshin chotzesin lachin enan chotzesin. We have a contradiction from a baraita. It's also in the Tosefta that says that blood and ink and honey and milk, if they're dry, they are in interposition. But if they're moist, then it's not an interposition. So you see here that if it's moist, it's not an interposition, and that includes blood. So that is a contradiction to Zaidi that said blood, even if it's moist, it is an interposition. So which one is it? La kashya ha disrich ha de la sirich. No, there's no contradiction. The Baraita is, Rav Gidel, in the name of Zaidi, is talking about a case where it adheres to the skin. In other words, it's moist, but it already started to congeal, is already a little bit sticky and sticking to the skin. Because it's sticking to the skin, it is in interposition, even though it's still liquidy. But the Baraita is talking about where it did not start congealing at all. It's not adhering, it's not sticky at all. It's totally liquidy, and if it's totally liquidy, then it is not an interposition. We now return to the pasuk about salting the meat that says timlach lemai ata. Here's the pasuk again. V'chol korban minchatecha b'melach timlach. We're wondering about this double language, that you should salt it with salt. I mean, what else are you going to salt it with? So you could just say timlach, or just say tasim melach. Why do you have to say b'melach timlach? So lemai ata, what is this coming to teach? Licha de Tanya, we learned in a Baraita. Ba'melach, yachol tibonehu. If it just had the word ba'melach, I might think, the tibonehu, we're going to see a few different interpretations. But it means something like, put a lot of salt, build it up, like make a building out of salt is one of the interpretations. Talmud omar timlach. No, it just says to salt it. So you don't have to put tons of salt. And if it said to salt it with the verb, I might think that salt water is okay. You could just pour some salt water on it. That's why it says with salt, meaning salt and not salt water. The Baraita continues, and do not omit the salt. Why does it have to add that in the pasuk? That's in the rest of the pasuk. V'lo tashbit melach berit Elohecha. That you should bring salt that never rests. That meaning that has an unlimited supply. What is that? Salt from Sidom. The Dead Sea is always providing more and more salt. You just take the water from there, the water evaporates, and more salt is there. Uminayin she'im lo masa melach Sidomit shemebi melach isterokanit. Now, how do you know that? Let's say he did not have salt from Sidom, that you can use salt from other places. This place seems to be a place that's on the border of Egypt, where also that was a salt production place. So how do you know that that salt also is okay? Talmud omar takrib kol shehu, takrib mikol makom, takrib afilu b'shabbat, takrib afilu b'tum'ah. And therefore, the pasuk says at the end, al kol korbancha takrib melach, and so that extra word is coming to be inclusive, to say, you can get the takrib kol shehu. You could bring it from anywhere, any type of salt from any place, even on Shabbat, even if it's even in a state of tum'ah. In other words, Shabbat, if there's a communal offering that you have to bring on Shabbat, then you put salt on it, even though it's Shabbat. And just like communal offerings, where if the majority of the people are in a state of impurity, you still bring it. So too, that applies to the salting, even in a state of impurity. My teboneho. Now going back to what we said over here, that if I had only the word Tim Bamelach, I might think that you would do Tivonehu. What does that mean? Amar Rabba bar Ulahachi kamar yechol yetabonenu keteben betit. I might think that I would put so much salt in as much as you put straw into clay. Making clay, you put a lot of straw. And so that comes from the word teben. No, if it meant straw, then it would be in the form yitbonenu, not tebonehu in the Braita. So that's not it. Ela amar Abaye yachol ya'asenu kibinyan. Abaye explains that you'd make a building. You have to build layers and layers of a building of salt upon the limbs. Amar le Rava ihachi yibnenu mi ba'ele. No, if it was from the root of binyan, then it would be yibnenu, not tevonehu in the Baraita. Ela amar Rava yachol tevonehu. Rava says tevonehu. Well, but what does that mean? My tevonehu amar Rava she yachol yiten bo lo ta'am kebina, that you might think that you have to give it taste like understanding. Bina, when you want to infuse a person with wisdom, you have to teach them a lot of wisdom that touches on all parts of their life and everything that they're doing. So too, I might think they have to put salt inside and outside in every nook and crevice. So if I had only the word bamelach, I might think that. Talmud omar timlach kesad hu oseh mebi ha'ebed v'noten alav melach v'chozer v'ofcho v'noten alav melach uma'alehu. That's why it says also the verb timlach. How do you do it? You bring a limb and you put salt on it and you flip it over and you put salt on the other side. That's it. You don't have to put it inside, right? You don't have to build it up like a building. That's sufficient. Amar Abaye v'chen likadera. This halacha is true not only for sacrifices but also for cooking. That applies nowadays. If one wants to cook meat in a pot, then you have to drain the blood. If you're going to barbecue it, then you don't have to salt the meat, because then any blood that comes out, only blood that comes out is prohibited. And so any blood that comes out will go onto the fire and it's gone. So that's okay. But if you're going to cook it in a pot, then you need to salt the meat to draw out the blood before cooking it. So how do you do it? You have to put salt inside every vein, every single spot? No, you do it the same as this. You put it on one side, turn it over, and you put it on the other side. Tenor banan, melach shal gabe ha'ebed mo'alin bo, shal gabe ha'kebesh sheberosho shel mizbeach and mo'alin bo. Another teaching about salt, that salt that's on the limb, if one gets benefit from that salt, you take some of that salt and you get benefit from it, then that's you violate me'ilah, meaning once you put the salt on the sacrificial limb, it becomes holy, part of the sacrifice. However, when you salt, sometimes they would salt on the ramp or on the top of the mizbeach, and if it just falls on the floor, you have some extra salt that falls on the floor, that is not holy. You do not commit me'ilah for that. You already salted the limb, so it served its purpose. This is just extra leftover. V'amar matana, mai kera'a v'krabtam lifnei Hashem v'ishlichu hakohanim alehem melach v'helu otam ola laHashem. Rab Matana says, what's the pasuk from which we can learn that salt also is considered holy and part of the sacrifice, and therefore one is liable to me'ilah if it's on the sacrifice? Pasuk in Yechezkel said, you shall sacrifice before Hashem, the priest shall cast salt upon them, and they shall offer them up as a burnt offering to Hashem. So you see that the korban itself and the melach that he puts on it, he'elu otam, everything, the meat and the salt are called a part of an olah, part of the korban to Hashem. And just like you would commit me'ilah for the meat, so too one would commit me'ilah for getting benefit from the salt. Tenan hatam, the Mishnah Shekalim teaches, al hamelach ve'al ha'esim sheyehu hakohanim ne'otin bahem, that the court made a decree regarding salt and wood, that the Kohanim are permitted to get benefit from it. We're talking about temple salt and temple wood, salt and wood that was donated, consecrated for the Mikdash. Even though they have to be used for the Mikdash, for Kodesh things, the Kohanim can get personal benefit from them without committing me'ilah. Now, what is this referring to? Amar Shemuel, lo shanu ela lekorbanam, aval achila lo. Shemuel said that salt can be used only for their sacrifices, but not for eating. So Shemuel's statement is difficult to understand. What does that mean? That the salt for the sacrifices is allowed, but not salt for eating? Let's analyze. Kasal kadatin, mai lekorbanam, limloach korbanam, le'echol achilat kodashim. So at first sight, it seems that Shemuel's teaching that salt is permitted to be used for korban. That means to put salt on their korbanam, their korbanot. If a kohen brings a korban, a personal korban, they want to bring a korban ola or shilamim or whatever, and you have to salt the parts of it that are sacrificial parts, so they can use the salt of the temple. They don't have to bring their own salt from home. And to eat means the parts of the sacrifices that they eat, like the parts of a korban hatat that they eat, that they have to, if they want to have salt with it, they have to bring their own salt from home. So that's achilat kodashim. Okay, so that seems to be the first interpretation of Shemuel. But now we ask about that. Hashtad limloach orot kodashim yahabinan, lachilat kodashim lo yahabinan. We're going to see in the Braita next that the Kohanim were allowed to use temple salt in order to salt the hides of animals that are brought. When you bring a korban, even a korban olah, the hide goes to the kohen. You don't burn the hide with it. And some other korbanot go to the kohanim. Now, the hide will spoil quickly if it's not salted, so it has to be salted right away. And the next baraita is going to teach that the Kohanim can use the temple salt in order to salt the hides that they're going to keep. They're going to take it home and turn it into a coat or a carpet or something. And now it doesn't make sense. If they can use temple salt even for the hides of the animals, then for eating sacrificial parts of the Korban Hatat or Korban Asham, all the more so. Shouldn't that be a higher level? Eating the sacrificial parts that's done in the Kodesh, that's part of the service of the Mikdash, shouldn't that be a higher level? So therefore, this first interpretation of Shemuel doesn't make sense. So first, let's see what this baraita teaches about the hides. The Tanya, Nimseta ata omer, bishlosha mekomot hamelach netuna. This is a Tosefta that says the salt placed in 3 locations in the Bet HaMikdash. B'lishkat hamelach, al gabe hakebesh, u'brosho shel mizbeach. One is in the courtyard of the salt. There's one chamber. One of the chambers here is the chamber of salt. That's where they kept the salt. And then, that is used for placement of salt in one case, and then on the ramp of the Mikdash over here, and also on the top of the Mizbeach. What is each place used for? It's in the chamber of salt. That's where they would salt the hides of kodashim. So that's the source, that hides that the kohanim are going to keep and take home. You can use temple salt for them. Off. On the ramp, that's where we put salt on the limbs of like a korban olah. First, you take all the limbs and you put them on the ramp, salt them there, and then you take them up and burn them. So that's the second place. And the third place that you do salting is on top of the mizbeach. That's the kometz. You take the kometz and then you carry it up the ramp, and then you're on top of the mizbeach itself. That's where you salt it. Also the lebona that you're going to burn there. Also ketoret that is burnt on top of the mizbacha ketoret is salted on the mizbacha ketoret, and also minchat kohanim. When a kohen brings a korban mincha, all of the flour gets burnt and salted on the mizbeach. And when the kohen gadol brings his daily korban mincha, it's salted and burnt on the mizbeach. And korban mincha that comes with along with an animal, also it's entirely burnt. All the flour has to be salted on the mizbeach, and also a korban olah from a bird is going to be salted on top of the mizbeach. So anyway, the point is that if kohanim can use salt for the hides that they take home, surely they should be able to use the temple salt for kodashim that they can eat. So rather, a new interpretation of Shemuel. When Shemuel said that they are permitted to use Shemuel explaining the Mishnah that says they are permitted to use the salt for korbanam, that's what he said right back here. Right, Shemuel said, Lo shanu, when did they give permission for korbanam? That means to eat the kodashim. Yes, in fact, when they're going to eat meat from sacrificial animals, they can put salt on it. Although they're getting personal benefit from it, that's okay. Actually, the salt that you're putting on the meat, that's on the sacrificial parts of the meat that get burnt, obviously that goes on. That's from the temple funds, from the temple salt. But here's the chidush. The rabbi said, okay, you're benefiting from this meat, but it's sacrificial meat. Okay, so you could use temple salt makes sense, because if you could use it for the hides, then surely you could use it for the meat. And what is not permitted? When it says eating, Shemuel meant eating chulin. If you're going to bring non-sacred food, and you want to eat some non-sacred food, maybe you want some salad or some other things together with the shawarma, together with the korbanot, you cannot do that. You cannot have salt. You have to bring your own salt. can't use the temple salt for chulin. We ask about that. Chulin peshita, mai ba'uatam. Obviously, you can't use temple salt for chulin. What would chulin be doing there? You're not allowed to bring chulin onto the temple courtyard. So it has nothing to do with it. Why? No one would ever think that you could. And the answer is actually you might. Afal gav de amar mor yochelu sheyochelu imach chulin utrumash kedesh shetehen nechelet ala soba. Afilu hachi melach de kodashim lo yahavinan lehu. Even though the master taught. And when the pasuk says yochelu, it's talking about a meal offering that the leftover had on, and his son shall eat it. And this means that when the Kohanim eat the flour, leftover flour, they should eat it together with chulin and teruma, so that it will be eaten and while satiated. The point is that when Kohanim eat the flour or the kodashim, whatever holy items they're eating, they shouldn't eat it in a ravenous way. Like they're so hungry, they didn't eat all day, and then they're stuffing their face. It's not a proper way to eat korbanot. Rather, one should eat some chulin first, right? And to break the hunger, so he won't be so hungry. And that's why on Pesach, this applies to regular people too, who are eating kodashim kalim. Like Korban Pesach, we have the Korban Chagiga, so that they'll eat the Korban Chagiga, you have some other food, you have masot, and then you eat Korban Pesach al hasoba. Well, not when you're very hungry, but rather when you are somewhat satiated. Shouldn't be stuffed either, but somewhere in the middle. So therefore, I might have thought, since one does eat chulin and teruma, one does eat chulin for the service of the korban, so that we won't be so hungry. Therefore, I might think that the salt, that I can use that salt, temple salt, to put salt on that other food that I'm bringing that's chulin. Since that food comes in the service of kodashim, maybe I could use temple salt with it. And that's why Shemuel says, not so. Even though you're bringing chulin for a good purpose, so that you can eat the korban properly, nevertheless, temple salt we do not give them. So that's a meaning of Shemuel. So this is good. We accept this explanation of Shemuel. The Kohanim are allowed to use temple salt for the sacrificial meat that they eat, but they cannot use temple salt for chulin that they would eat alongside that korban. Amar le Ravina le Rav Asher, hachiname mistaberat isa kadatech mai le korbanam limloach tama de'atni bedin hala atni bedin loa hashta lisel habinan lechohanim lo yehabinan. And Rabina tells Rav Asher this explanation makes a lot of sense, because if you would think, as we did before, that le korbanam, that which the bedin permitted is to use salt for the korban itself, the part that you're going to burn on the mikdash. So that would be a private korban. For a public korban, obviously use temple salt for any public korban. But the point is here that the original way we interpreted Shemuel was that for the private korbanot of Kohanim, they can use temple salt. If that's the meaning, then that means the only reason why it's permitted for Kohanim to use it is because the Bet Din made a condition. And if they had not made a condition, then no, the Kohanim would not be able to use temple salt for the sacrificial parts, the parts that are burnt of their own korbanot. But that wouldn't make any sense, because when a Israel brings a private korban, we let them use temple salt for the parts that are sacrificed. So if you're going to let Israel use temple salt for their individual sacrifices, all the more so for Kohanim, you will also have to let them use the temple salt for the sacrificial parts. The Tanya, as we taught in a Braita. In other words, we wouldn't need a Tanai Betin. This would have to be obvious even before the Tanai Betin, that they can use Kohanim as Israel can use temple salt to salt the parts of the sacrifices that are burnt on the Mizbeach. So that has to be a given, and it's not dependent on a Tanai Betin. Detanya, Yachol HaOmer, Hare Alai Mincha Yavi Melach Mitoch Beto. Now we're going to prove that when Israel brings a private korban, that he can use temple salt in order to salt the parts that are burnt. When it says, when someone says, Hareh la mincha, I take upon myself to bring a korban mincha, does he have to bring the salt together with it? Maybe you might think that. After all, he does have to bring lebona, even though he said, I'm going to bring a meal offering. Well, part of the meal offering is a lebona, and the person donating has to bring that. V'din has to pay for it. V'din hu. Ne'emar haveh mincha v'haveh melach. V'ne'emar haveh melach v'haveh lebona. Ma lebona mitoch beto, af melach mitoch beto. Now here's the argument for saying yes, that he has to bring the salt also from his home, since the Pasukim say that when you bring a Korban Mincha, you have to bring salt. And it says when you bring Mincha, you have to bring Levona. The Pasukim are here. Whenever every meal offering, you shall season with salt. And it says, and you should put frankincense on it. So since the Pasukim say that, you bring Korban, a meal offering, the one pasuk says you have to bring salt. It says bring salt. The other pasuk says bring levona. So therefore, we can compare them to each other. Just like levona, you have to bring it from your own home. You have to pay for it. So to salt, you have to bring it from your own home, and you have to pay for it. That's the first. That's one possibility. We're going to reject it. Or kelach lederech zo. Or maybe we should go in a different direction. Ne'emar haveh mincha v'haveh melach. V'ne'emar haveh mincha v'haveh aisim. Ma'asim mishel sibur. Af melach mishel sibur. Pesukim say that when you bring korban mincha, you have to bring salt. But the Pesukim also say when they bring korban mincha, you're going to have to burn it. So you're going to need wood. Now, wood, that comes from the communal offerings of wood. Person who brings a korban mincha doesn't have to bring their own wood to burn it. So therefore, we can compare these two together. And just like wood, you use the communal funds. So to salt, you could use the communal funds, the temple salt. So now we have two options. Which one should we choose? Which one is more similar? Well, it makes sense that we should apply something that applies to all korbanot from something else that applies to all korbanot, and that is salt and wood. Salt you need in all korbanot, and so also wood you need for every korban, anything that's burnt. And so therefore it makes sense to argue that those are the same. Lebona only applies to some things. Doesn't apply to any animal offerings, and applies only to most, but not even all, meal offerings. And so therefore that would make sense that to be the main comparison, and therefore you would not you would not have to bring your own salt. But is also the other counter argument. Maybe we should apply compare something that comes along with the meal offering in the same vessel. That's the levona, and not something that does not come together with the same vessel, which is the wood. And so we should compare the salt. So the salt comes together in the same vessel, together with the kometz and the lebona. So since they come in the same vessel, we should compare them, and don't bring wood, because wood is not brought in the same vessel, and therefore we should compare the salt to the levona, and just like levona has to be brought from one's home, maybe salt also has to be brought from one's home. So this comparison of the content is ambiguous. Talmud Omar berit melach olam hi ulhalanu omer me'et bnei Israel berit olam ma lehalan mishel sibur avkan mishel sibur. So finally, since just through logic we can't figure it out because they're similar, they're both similar in different ways. Therefore, we turn to Pesukim, and one pasuk says regarding salt berit melach olam hi. And another pasuk regarding the lechem apanim says that will come from Bnei Israel, berit olam. So it says berit here, berit olam, and it says berit olam here. So therefore we make a gezer hashava. Just like the shobra, the lechem apanim, comes from the communal funds. So too, the salt that has to be brought together with any korban, even private korbanot, even of a Yisrael, and certainly of a Kohen, that have to be that is brought from the temple salt, and so an individual does not have to bring it. And so that was a proof that it would be impossible to think of to accept the first interpretation of Shemuel, that the Bet Din said that the Kohanim can use salt for the parts that are offered on the Mizbeach. That doesn't make sense, because a Yisrael doesn't have to bring his own salt for his private korbanot. All the more so, Kohen wouldn't have to, and the the condition of Bet Din would not be the thing that would permit that. So therefore, the second interpretation is better, that in fact the condition of the Bet Din was about the Kohanim using the salt for the sacrificial parts that they eat. That, the Bet Din said, you can do that. But just make sure, don't use the temple salt for the cholin, the parts that you are going to, the cholin, that even if you're bringing it before the meal, so that you can eat the korban properly, but for that, you have to bring your own salt. You can't use the temple salt for that. Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rav Asher, hachi kama Rav Shisha bered Rav Idi, lo nisracha ela leben bukhri. Rav Mordechai tells Rav Asher that Rav Shisha, the son of Rav Idi, said that our original explanation of Shemuel actually was necessary if we follow the opinion of Ben Bukhri. Let's explain. The first explanation of Shemuel is that when Shemuel read the Mishnah, he said, Lo Shanu. When the Mishnah says that the Bet Din said that Kohanim are permitted to use the temple salt for their korban, but not for achila, that meant for their korban means that the Kohanim beforehand were not permitted to use the temple salt for the parts of their korbanim that are burnt on the Mizbeach. They have to use their own salt. And then the Bet Din came and said, you know what? You can use the temple salt for the parts of the korban that are burnt on the Mizbeach. About that, we rejected it for a couple of reasons, but one of them is because if a Yisrael who brings a private korban can use the temple salt for the burnt parts of their offering, then doesn't it make sense that all the more so Kohanim, if who bring an individual offering, should be able to use the temple salt for the burnt parts of their offering. And so we rejected that, and we had a second explanation of Shemuel. But now, Rav Shisha is saying, actually, that first explanation would be necessary if we follow the opinion of Ben Bukhri, who said that Kohanim do not give machasit shekel. So it works like this. Yisrael who give machasit shekel, so they contribute to the communal fund. So therefore, it makes sense that they should be able to use the temple salt, because they paid into that fund, so they should be able to use it. They're not getting personal benefit from it. This is for the parts of their korbanot. They get burnt on the Mizbeach. Whereas Kohanim, according to Ben Bukhri, do not give machasit shekel. And therefore, since they don't pay into the fund, they don't deserve to be able to use the temple salt that's bought from that fund. That's the idea. Let's see Ben Bukhri's opinion in this Mishnah Masechet Shekalim Ditnan. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Harid Ben Bukhri b'Yavne, Kol Kohen sheshokel eno hoteh. Ben Bukhri testified in Yavne that any Kohen who gives machasita shekel is not a sinner, meaning he certainly doesn't have to. If he wants to, there's a reason why you might think it's not allowed to. We'll see that in a second. But the point is, he says it's totally optional. In fact, it's not a sinner, but certainly doesn't have to. Amar lo Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, lo ki ela kol Kohen sheno shokel hoteh, ela shekanu doshin mikra ze le'atzman. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says the opposite. Any Kohen who does not give machasita shekel is a sinner. You have to give it, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he says, he notes that the Kohanim, they make a derasha that's for their own benefit, but it's not a correct derasha. They're only doing it so that they don't have to pay. This is their derasha. V'chol minchat kohen kalil tiyeh lo te'achel. Ho'il ve'omer u'shteh halechem. V'lechem hapanim shelanu hi he'achne chalin. There's a general rule regarding korban mincha that a kohen brings. He brings it for himself. Then it's entirely burnt, and this should not be eaten. Now, the korban ha'omer that you bring on Pesach, and Shel Lechem that you bring on Shavuot, and Lechem HaPanim that you bring every week, Shelanu, it belongs to the Kohanim in the sense that the Kohanim are able to eat it. Now, if the Kohanim would pay into Machasita Shekel, and then that Machasita Shekel would be used to buy the flour for all of these offerings, well then, how could the Kohanim eat it? Any Kohen who brings his own Korban, is not allowed to eat it. And therefore, actually, the Kohanim argue, it would be prohibited for them to pay machasita shekel, because then they would not be able to eat from the communal meal offerings. And therefore, the Kohanim say, we certainly do not have to bring machasita shekel. Maybe even they can't. ולבן בוכרי כיוון דלכתחילה לה מחייב לאיתויה, כי מי תנה מחותהו דקמאייל חולין עזרה. And then we ask, okay, if you follow that, I mean, the Rebbe Zakai says it's a selfish derasha. He disagrees with it. But if we follow Ben Bukhari, then how in fact does he say, why does he say enochote? Since lechatechila, the Kohanim are not liable to bring machasita shekel. If they do bring it, then it should be called that they are sinners because they're bringing cholin to the azara. This is money that they're bringing, that's cholin money, because they're not obligated to bring it, so it doesn't become sanctified. And now they're bringing this cholin money to the azara, which is prohibited. So why don't we say that they're sinners? And in addition to the problem that now this money is going to be used to buy consecrated things, and then how could they eat their own meal offerings and so on? So the answer is actually demaite umasar lehon lasibor. They can bring it, and then it transfers to the community. When they bring it, they're not giving it in as their own personal money. They're giving it in, and then it's okay, this becomes the money of the community. So it ends up being communal funds. So they don't have to bring it, but they can bring it, and it will be just like a Yisrael who brings it. It turns into, it's not their own personal, it starts with their personal, they consecrate it, and that becomes communal funds. So Kohen can do that too, but he doesn't have to. Now that we establish that that's Ben Bukhri's opinion, here is why we would need Shemuel, according to Ben Bukhri. Sakada tech amina, ki zachi lehu rachamana l'Yisrael, dit lehu lishka, lakohanim delet lehu lishka, la zachi lehu rachamana kamashma lan. Because I might think that when the Torah says that the temple salt can be used, temple salt can be used for Yisrael because they pay into Lishkat Hagazit. They give machasita shekel. But Kohanim who do not pay in to machasita shekel, so there the Torah would say, Rachamana, Hashem would say, sorry, you don't pay in, then you can't use it. And Kamash Malan. And that's why the Mishnah, according to this first interpretation of Shemuel, the Mishnah would teach us that the court came and said, listen, I know you guys, you didn't pay into machasita shekel, you're not liable to, and nevertheless, we are going to make this decree that you are permitted to use the temple salt for your individual korbanot in order to salt those parts of the korban that are burnt on the Mizbeach. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.